Hi, my name is Daria Mezensova and welcome to Politeka World Show. And today we will analyze the whole picture of all-out war in Ukraine since February 24th. Furthermore, we will learn what is helping the Ukrainian army be on the horseback, over what issues still Ukrainian army get to ensure breakout, and what does the analysis of the developments on the front line augur for the future of the war. We will talk about it with a military expert, Glenn Grant. Glenn, I'm happy to have you here on my show.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. Delighted you've got electricity.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. And also with us here, the military expert who served in US Navy and now he's working with Ukrainian Freedom Fund, Nico Woods. Nico, I'm happy to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, and I would like to tell you thank you for the work you do for supporting Ukraine, because it's really important humanitarian work that you did and you will do in the future for our defenders. So thank you.
Thank you. Happy to help.
Yeah, thank you. So let's start from the last information we had from the experts, and we now hear that the situation on the front line remained fairly stable after Ukraine recaptured Kherson in November, and bringing to around 50% of the territories that were occupied after Russia launched its full-scale invasion. So, on the other hand, we heard the information that combat capability of the ground forces, Russian ground forces, has fallen by more than 50%. So, Nico, I would like to start from you. So, what are the main reasons that give Ukrainian army this capability to advance? Because when the war started, I was in Kiev, and for me it was like unbelievable. We didn't have the light at the end of the tunnel where our army could advance and what would happen.
I think it's two things. One, the resilience of the Ukrainian people, their unwillingness to surrender and keep pushing forward has been remarkable, especially when I too remember in Kyiv, I believe the Western strategists thought that Kyiv would fall within a week, and the Ukrainians were able to prove them wrong. And I think it's part of that resilience. And then as the war got on, I believe it was the communication between Ukraine and the West in terms of what was needed in terms of military equipment. In the beginning of the war, it was NLAWs so that they could take out vehicles. And then later on, we saw the introduction of long-range artillery. And so in this war where no one can really control the skies, it's been forced to be fought on the ground. And when you're in a ground battle, you're almost like in a World War I scenario where you have moving fronts that are only being moved by artillery. And so going forward, as Ukraine is able to reclaim land, we see this where the ability for them to shoot and attack long range is able to help them secure more land.
So how do you feel? What helped to make this decision to give Ukraine long-range artillery? It was happened not far away, as I know.
That's correct. So I'm sure there are some discussions that go on in terms of what is needed and versus what is wanted. And but one thing was clear, and I think what we see from the West is that this is not only a fight for Ukraine's sovereignty, but for democracy around the world. And if we cannot come together and support Ukraine, then there could be rippling effects. So I think countries are starting to realize that Ukraine, having been in this for 10 months, they are almost the subject matter experts. And now, compared to at the beginning, maybe they didn't know what they wanted, but now, given that they've been fighting day in and day out, they pretty much know what they need. And as I said, this is a ground war for the most part. So this long-range artillery is the only way that they're going to be able to move kilometers down the battlefield.
So, but why you think that it's mostly ground for? There are a lot of strikes around whole Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of the advancement of where the Ukrainian army is able to move, those lines are defined by the fronts of where the trenches are and where the Russians have set up defenses. So don't get me wrong. One of the things that we've seen since the summertime is the ability for the Russian Federation to launch countless missiles into Ukraine, mainly hitting civilian targets. So that has had some setbacks, but I mean, again, the resilience of the Ukrainians to keep pushing forward. I think we see this situation now where Russia is almost out of missiles and they've only lost land since the summertime.
Yeah, Glenn, what is your point of view on the situation, why Ukrainian military forces got success? Because, as I said before, nothing foreshadowed such development in the beginning of the war, such a breakthrough. I even didn't believe that it could happen so quickly.
I think it's different in different areas. I mean, there's no question in Kharkiv that it was a classic sort of maneuver activity where the 80 Brigade actually got through the front line, got round behind Izium, and then the Russians started to run away. This is really important because, you know, Russians do run away when the enemy starts to appear behind them or in places that they don't like. So in the north, this was you know, pretty classic. And we also had a piece of that down near Kherson as well, where there was a breakthrough, and then the Russians just literally ran away and left things like guns and rocket launchers behind, because they did not want to be pinned against the river and just defeated by you know, man to man. But there was also a lot of what infantry would call toe-to-toe fighting down by Kherson, and this is what is going on in Bakhmut now. And the fact is that when it is toe-to-toe fighting, it shows that the Ukrainian forces are much better at that than the Russian forces. I mean, not just the motivation, but the infantry skills are higher. So they're actually winning in toe-to-toe battles by quite a lot. But the challenge for Ukraine is that toe-to-toe battles are extremely resource intensive. I mean, extremely. They burn through ammunition. And actually, they burn through ammunition at a rate probably often faster than it comes from the West. So you might say, why has there been a delay? Well, you know, sometimes there is an inevitable delay whilst you have to catch up with ammunition, you have to catch up with other things. Toe-to-toe fighting is also expensive in people, and you get casualties. So you have to pull units out of the front line, give them new people, let them breathe before they go back in again to fight again.
Yeah, so Glenn, do you expect, excuse me to interrupt you, do you expect the further mobilization in Ukraine, as we know that the mobilization in Russia wasn't been stopped, as it was told by Russian officials. So we understand that Russia has more this scandal than Ukraine. So how do you see this situation, how it could influence the success on the front line by Ukrainian military forces?
I mean, this is a good question. I mean, Russia's got more orcs. There's no question. And then most of them are not well trained. Some of them coming later will be because they've had longer to train them. Maybe they may get proper training. They may not as well. The question for Ukraine is one of organization. And that is, do we keep bringing new people in, or do we actually now take the territorial forces and restructure them and train them properly? Because at the moment that is not happening. So territorial forces are partly trained, but they're not trained to the same standard as the brigades, the former brigades are. This is an organizational matter, and this is something not just for the general staff, but this is actually something for Parliament, because Parliament created the territorial structure, but Parliament hasn't actually re-looked at the whole thing about reserves and soldiers and how do we use them best. And that needs rethinking if we're going to go into a long war.
Mm-hmm. So, do you, Nico, do you see such a problem which now described Glenn?
I do. This war has been raging on for 10 months. Very early on, Russian forces targeted most military bases, so the ability for the Ukrainians to conduct training have been limited. And then just over time, as new recruits get added, it's showing an almost pressing need to provide more training. On the nonprofit side, I would say in the last 6 months, I've seen an increase in the number of nonprofits that bring in former military members from Western or NATO countries to come in and at no cost provide training, because in the summertime, it was a very bloody summer, and a lot of Ukrainians were just not familiar with the proper medical training. And the number one casualty was that Ukrainians were bleeding out before they reached the first casualty collection point. So that's why, on my side, it was great. It's one thing to give tourniquets and first aid kits, but then it's another thing to provide the training so that individuals know how to do the tourniquets and the first aid. So I think Glenn is absolutely correct. If going into 2023, training needs to be more part of the conversation as to for the Ukrainian army.
What else can military officers in Ukraine do to make this problem easier for them? Easier to advance on the front line when Russian military forces have more cannon fodder?
I've seen one of the most remarkable things was the ingenuity of the Ukrainian commanders, and it's the launching of these volunteer drone units. These are units that commanders willingly give their personnel to form the volunteer battalions, and those commanders, they can't get a replacement because they have the person on their books, so these commanders are being progressive in that they're willing to let these volunteer battalions go. And what we've seen is Ukraine before the war, very great IT sector, a lot of good talent here. And we've seen remarkable improvements in both tactics and use of drones in this war. And I think that is something that is going to be revolutionary going into 2023.
So if we're talking about tactics, so what I heard from some military experts, they told me that Ukraine has good tactics, good strategy, but in the long-term run, Ukrainian military forces don't have enough tactics to observe the situation for future in the war. What is your point of view on this?
I think what we're seeing is going to be a changing landscape. So it's going to be hard to predict. This winter, we're seeing a lot of pressure and stress on supply lines, especially on the Russian side. And then going into the spring, it's hard to assess what Russia will do. I know there's discussions of possible Belarusian incursion. And so this kind of unknown adds to the complexity for these Ukrainian commanders to kind of plan what is next. I think the only thing that would be beneficial is that there are units that are performing very well, that have adopted tactics that are working. And if there is a mechanism to have that shared with other units so that Ukrainians can learn from others, so that they can keep making sure they're going forward, I think that would be very, very good.
Glenn, do you agree that Ukraine is good in strategic planning, but not as good as in strategic in tactics in its long run? So how do you think, how far-sighted is it?
I think this is a very good discussion, actually. I mean, one of the things about strategy is any strategy relies upon capabilities. And the capabilities in this case are, infantry and mechanized brigades. and now the territorial forces, and now the volunteer battalions with drones. Now, what is needed to make the strategy work is greater integration of those organizations, probably some law changes as well, to allow to force stronger integration, because we have things like GUR and the special forces that are actually working often independently of the brigades, and even trying to use the same space. And these are important things that need tying together for the future. So the strategy needs a bit more thinking about how you put all the pieces of the strategy jigsaw together. Now, the US, is going to provide training in Germany for people, primarily to look at fire and maneuver in a different way. Because one of the things that the Ukraine has been using is the modern systems to hit precision targets. Now, the problem with that is they were never designed for this. They were designed to create the beginnings of fire and maneuver. So you fire, pin people down, and then you maneuver. And if you just fire and kill, you can never beat Russia like this, because it's always got more targets than you've got ammunition and people. So strategy, yes, it's a good strategy, but it does need rethinking about how you actually use the pieces of the jigsaw to make that strategy work.
Glenn, what do you feel about the advancement of Ukrainian military forces? What would allow the Ukrainian army to keep on the rolling rock and go further?
I think there's two or three things. Obviously, the ability to move more powerfully. So getting tanks, if they got some modern tanks with longer range firing, with better surveillance, and ability to move across the ground better, that would be a big help. There is no question about that.
When it could be happen?
It's not going to happen at the moment, because even if say America or someone else promised tanks that they are going to come, we'd still take a couple of months before actually getting them into the battlefield.
But they didn't promise, as I know, yet.
No, they didn't promise, and we know this. And this is, or you could say that there are half promises for a long time, but we have not had that promise. But those tanks are needed. The second thing is, going back to what we said at the beginning, is training. There needs to be more training, because if you only put people in with limited training, then they can't actually follow through all the battlefield skills that you actually need. And you just asked one question: how long does it take to train a metro driver? It's a lot longer than infantry soldiers are being given.
How long each military brigade should be trained?
Well, as long as you can train them. If you take First World War, then infantry battalions were often getting a year training before they actually went into the front line. Now it takes a long time to train people properly as a brigade, because it's like an orchestra. If you take an orchestra of 3,000 people and try to train them, you're going to get a lot of noise. You'll still get individual good things from the drummer, from percussion, from brass, but they won't actually be an orchestra. And this is it. So we need to think again about the whole training to make people better, because that quality is what will actually allow people to drive forward faster. The ability to plan, the ability to synchronize is key. Not just small tactical battles one-on-one.
Yeah, and Nico, how do you expect the situation on the battlefield and, of course, the advancement on the, I could tell, battlefield of military stuff, how it's coming to Ukraine? As we know, after the first visit of Zelensky to the other country abroad, yes, so we didn't get what we expect. I think so, especially. So Zelensky told about what I could tell. So battle tanks, fighter jets, and long-range precision missiles. But we only got from this visit for 2 million one Patriot system. So how could you explain such position of US? Before we thought that US changed it and would give us much more ammunition. Yes, would like to be grateful for all they done for us, but why they didn't give us tanks as Europe does, for example? Ukrainian army doesn't deserve it, or something else is here?
It is a complex problem. I think the easiest way to think about it is it's a combination of, you have to consider need, risk of escalation, training, and then there's the technological loss. So what I mean by that is need. I think Ukraine has established that. Risk of escalation. That's where it gets a little dicey, because you're playing this game with Russia, the US and Russia, as to if US were to give tanks to Russia, would that cross a red line where Russia would say US is now part of this war?
US gives, you mean to Ukraine?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. But yes, but if Russia considers that like a red line, then that could be problematic, and that is driving some of the factors.
But Patriot system, it could be a problem. It's Patriot system. It's air defense system from NATO country. Yeah. So, but battle tanks, it's much easier thing, I think, to effort.
Well, for the battle tanks too, there's some technological advances to it.
Okay.
And so that's why one argument is that if Russia believes that Ukraine is receiving far more technologically advanced equipment that could put Russia at a disadvantage, they might say, hey, US, we're considering this like an act of aggression, and we might pull you into this, or they might blame the US for something. So there's a concern of trying to balance the need, but also try not have a risk of escalation. For the training part, the biggest thing about the Patriot missile systems that I've tried explaining to my friends and family since the beginning of the war is that it typically takes 6 months to train an operator. And again, going back to that risk of escalation, the US is not going to send people into Ukraine to conduct the training. As Glenn mentioned, US has set up training in Germany. So now you're going to have Ukrainians go to Germany, and can you really afford to have soldiers not on the battlefield for 6 months to get the proper training? And then again, it's where the Patriot missiles are coming from. Are they coming directly from the US, or does the US give aid to a NATO country, and then a NATO country provides it to Ukraine? So that adds to the supply chain problem. And then the last thing that has been a minor concern has been with the increasing of advanced technology that the US is giving, what happens if it gets lost on the battlefield? What happens if Russia takes it? And then they're able to understand how it works.
But what do you mean by escalation? Nuclear tactic weapons? What else could be happened? Today we could see here in Kiev that there is terroristic attacks through whole Ukraine. What else? I don't think that Russia can make the decision to use nuclear weapons.
Well, they can, because I think that's what complicates this, is that according to Russian military doctrine, the use of tactical nukes in a conventional war like this is authorized. And what I mean by tactical nuke, it's 50 kilotons. And just for comparison, Hiroshima was 1/3 that. So you could, according to Russian military doctrine, you can have a nuclear bomb that's 3 times as powerful as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and they don't have a problem with it because it's authorized according to their doctrine in a conventional war. So I think because of that, people don't want to be risking or being blamed, oh, we were the reason why Russia used the nuke.
Glenn, what is your position on nuke, and how do you feel? Don't you think that Russia doesn't want to do it because it's not in its interests? They will lose from that more, or we couldn't talk here from the point of rationality or something like that?
I agree with you that I don't think Russia would even consider using nuclear weapons. I think this is just part of the bluff. And I think that America is overstating this risk problem because I don't think they spend enough time and energy on the subject and actually looking at it. You have to remember that America, has got its own internal problems. It still hasn't sorted out the Trump problem yet. And I'm pretty sure that the amount of time they spend each day considering Ukraine is not a huge amount. So I think that they're overestimating this risk problem because, if you think about it, if Russia fires it, that's the end of the war. That's the end of Russia. This is not going to be a nice thing. Secondly, they're likely to get their own back because the wind blows towards Russia most of the time. So they're quite likely to actually to get the dust and disaster straight back into Russia. The third thing is that we know that most of their weapons are actually not working properly because they're degraded just the same way as all the rest of their conventional weapons. Why would you fire? Why would you ruin the life of your country completely when remembering that most of your family are in the West anyway? Children are in school there. Children are living there. So I don't think Russia is going to play this game. We are overstating the risk.
Yeah, but nevertheless, Ukraine got the aid from the Congress for $50 billion. It's a good sum for Ukraine. It's big money. Nico, could you open the door? What could Ukraine expect for compared to the amount which was told by our military officials?
So one thing about this recent bill that's being sent to President Biden to sign into law is that Ukraine received more than what the lawmakers asked for because with the change of Congress going to the slight Republican majority, funding in the future is not guaranteed. So they did make it a little bit bigger than what was asked. And how that is broken down is that half of that is being directed towards military aid or to replenish the stock that the U.S. has sent over to Ukraine. 25% of that is going to economic stability in Ukraine. Pensioners, government workers, soldiers, they have to be paid cash every month. You can't just not pay them. And then the last 25% is split between refugees, supporting refugees, and then also bolstering NATO's presence in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how do you feel 25% from this sum, 50 billion, is it enough for economic much more stability in Ukraine? As I know, Ukraine needs around $100 billion. And can we get more from the other countries? What do you know about it?
So right now, Ukraine is, it looks like they may have enough funding to support its 2023 budget. So right now, Ukraine is operating a monthly $5 billion deficit. And the combination between US support and EU support coming together in the next few weeks should be able to provide enough financing to cover that deficit going into 2023, which is a very good blessing. It will help stabilize the hryvnia and allow Ukraine to keep operating in 2023. Because I think one of the things we'll see in 2023, Ukrainian military has shown very great excellence on the battlefield, but this is going to slowly become an economic war. And we have to make sure that Ukraine economically can survive this longer than Russia.
Mm-hmm. And you meant $15 billion from Europe, yes? What was agreed, yes? And plus this money from America, yeah? Mm-hmm. Okay, Glenn, do you have the same position as Nico that economically Ukraine could be more stable than Russia?
I think so, yeah. But I would say that there is a need still for Ukrainian government to think a lot harder about its economic policies internally, especially for things like it's supporting entrepreneurship, because the country has got to get back on its own feet. It makes no sense having people who are unemployed at a time of war at all, and so there's a lot of economic thinking that needs to go on. I'm afraid that the government is still working, you could say, in a Soviet thinking fashion, and not in not in a Western thinking fashion as in terms of the economy. I think there's another thing that Nico didn't say is that, of course, the money coming in is not really sufficient to fight a long war, and at some stage, Ukraine has actually got to start producing its own weapon systems or more weapon systems, and to think a lot harder itself about self-sufficiency in terms of the battlefield, because there is no way that the ammunition in its current form is going to continue, and this people have been saying this for at least 6 months, so this is nothing new from me. So Ukraine must start producing its own ammunition, and increasing the amount of things like drones that it produces itself. And that means rethinking at the ministry level and the government level of how these things are actually, how they're done, how they're thought through, and how they're procured. Because it's not actually the most efficient that it could be.
Glenn, do you expect more air defense systems for Ukraine? Something similar to Patriot systems, or something else?
To be honest, I think that once we got Patriot, I think that the air defense is probably as balanced as it should be for this war, because actually the amount of damage is bad. There's no question about that. It's horrible. But if we keep just concentrating on that damage against society, that is exactly what Russia wants, because that means that money is being eaten for defending society that is badly needed for defending the infantry to use in the front line. And this war is not going to be won with society. Society is strong. It is really strong. But the front line needs constant feeding with resources to keep it fighting. And the war is going to be won on the front line. So we need to think about the balance of what's being asked for. Balance versus the political part of society versus the military part of winning the war on the front line.
Yeah, but still we know that, for example, 10 rockets from 100, yes, it's not a big amount, but they targeted the energy infrastructure and civilian infrastructure, and people die in Ukraine, yes. So, Nico, if we are talking about the next step on the battlefield, from the analysis, what I have now, the hottest points are in Kherson and in Bakhmut. Now we could see that Ukrainian military forces start to advance on Bakhmut direction. How can you estimate the next step? Maybe counteroffensive by Ukrainian army. I heard about Melitopol, but it's not an easy thing to do that.
I think in the coming months, because of the winter, we're going to see strained supply lines on the Russian front. What we've already seen is that Russians running low on artillery shells, which is the main form of offensive they've been showing in the east. So we're going to see that as those dwindles, hopefully the Ukrainians will be able to make moves. But the Russians planned the winter to be entrenched. So it's going to be very hard to push them out. And then we can only hope that by the springtime, as Russian morale continues to dwindle, that they will, their spirit would be broken. And that would just be enough to have the Ukrainians, along with the increasing aid from the West, to continue pushing them out. Of course, if Ukraine could also focus on strangling their supply lines. I think that would help expedite it. The attack on the Kerch Bridge in October, it only damaged it. So they're still able to resupply Crimea from that bridge, but it did hinder their supply lines going into 2023.
Glenn, but nevertheless, we know that Russian military forces fortified the occupied territories, and now Ukrainian military forces start to advance on Bakhmut direction. So what do you read in the last developments on the battlefield? And do you agree with Nico words?
Yeah, I agree with Nico. The thing about it is fortifications are only as good as the people that are in them. So, you can make trenches, but if the soldiers in those trenches are not trained to actually to fight a trench warfare, or they're not properly fed, as the Russians often do, or they don't get the ammunition, or they haven't got the means to get proper fire support, then those defensive works are of no use to anybody. So I think that one of the things you will see is that the Russians may be making a lot of defense works, but when the Ukrainian forces actually push against them, they will break, because the boys inside are simply not good enough to actually to fight from them in a coherent fashion. And I suspect that a lot of them will have trench foot. They'll have hypothermia because they haven't been given generators, they haven't been given warmth. So the harder, the more that Ukraine actually pushes against Russia, the quicker I think the break will come.
But how do you measure the situation with artillery from Ukrainian side? Do we have enough of such weapons?
Yeah, you never have enough artillery, ever. This is
to advance.
This is
and,
the thing about advancing is that if you break through, once you break through, you don't fire artillery that much. You only fire it to unbreak log jams. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the reasons why the Americans want to teach fire and maneuver to people, because if you're just defending, you need as much artillery as you can to break up the enemy artillery on the other side. But once you get behind people, their artillery becomes useless because they can't work quickly enough to use it against you. So this is why maneuver is so important and modern in warfare. It was important in the First World War, which is why we created the tank to break through, and it was important in the Second World War. The more you move, the faster you move, the less artillery you actually need as a component in the battlefield. The slower you are, the more you need.
The Ukrainian army first or second, you told. So now Ukrainian army moves faster or slowly?
It's been in defense a lot, and it has to have been in defense because of the mud, but and because of the difficulty. But now in Bakhmut, they've started to actually to break, to move forward. And I think that if that is reinforced hard, that the troops on the other side of Bakhmut will break, because they're not going to be very happy if they think that all their work and all the people that have died has been for nothing. They're not strong on morale, the Russian troops, and it's the morale that we have to hit as hard as possible so that they don't want to fight.
Okay.
And Bakhmut is a we shall see in the next week or two.
Okay, and the last but not the least, we could read from some analysis that in April it could be the offensive in Ukraine from the Belarusian side, and experts told us about two scenarios, more and less probable, but Belarus is somehow involved in both, what I could read from the last news. So according to the first option, Russia can launch a large-scale offensive of the Donbass and use Belarusian army like a red herring. And the next thing, it could be like a full invasion from the Belarusian border. So, Nico, how do you measure such scenarios? So could we see the science of building such plans if we take first and second option?
So we have seen the buildup of over 12,000 Russian soldiers in Belarus, as well as the importation of Iranian-made missiles into Belarus. So they are building up for something. But what we've also seen is that the Ukrainians, for the last few months, have been building walls, have been building trenches, have been mining the border. They have been building underground cities. They've even gone out publicly and said, we're going to be ready. So I almost kind of want to, like, tongue in cheek say, I think, it's a combination of the two scenarios where I do think it's probable in a spring offensive that there will be an attack launched from Belarus, but I think it's going to be the Ukrainians are going to be so well prepared that maybe the Russians will try to claim it not as a full-scale invasion, but as a red herring, because I think Ukrainians will be able to rebuff that attack.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, what do you feel about it, and how do you expect the situation with the quantity of militants that could be involved in such a battle from the Belarusian border?
I mean, to just talk about Belarus, I think it would be extremely risky of Russia to start an attack there, because there is always that chance that a lot of the Belarusian soldiers will simply either turn around and run, or give up, or actually turn against the Russians. And 12,000 is not enough for an attack. That will be eaten very, very quickly, because most of those Russians are from the last mobilization thing. If we see 100,000 come into Belarus, then I would start worrying.
And Glenn, how long could it take to gather such quantity as you told us?
They've got using the railways, probably 6 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks. They could do that, so we'd see it coming. And if they move that many people to Belarus, then they're not going to have that many people available in the Donetsk area. So there's a bit of an either or for them. But if they go for bigger numbers, you can be sure that half those bigger numbers are not trained or are not properly equipped. They'll be coming with rifles from before the Second World War. And they'll be acting like a lot of the soldiers have been, that we've been killing in large numbers, because they're simply not got any tactical skills whatsoever. So, a big attack, yes, and it could be extremely hard for Ukraine just because of the numbers. But I still don't see that Russia in the next 6 months is going to be able to put something together to actually to beat the quality of the Ukrainian forces as they are at the moment. They can just try to wear them out or wear out the ammunition. So that's the more difficult problem.
And Nico, do you expect that this war could be as long as it was with Balkans wars? Just in a few words, because there are a lot of such scenarios was described by American experts.
I think with the overwhelming support of the West and the resilience of the Ukrainian people, I think this is going to be a shorter war than the Balkans.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And what do you think, Glenn, just in a few words about such?
I always say I think this can go two ways. The first way is Russia could collapse overnight. They just collapse, the front line collapse, and everybody start running. And that we nearly got close to that a couple of times. But I think that Russia is robust. I think it will just keep going and throwing people at Ukraine as long as they can do, until Russia itself understands that it's beaten. And that's my worry. It's not just about the front line. It's the Russian the headquarters and society actually saying, "Oh dear, we've lost this. Now we need to change." That could be a lot longer than we would wish. it could be a couple of years, actually.
Yeah, I believe that the war will be finished as much as much as we could imagine quicker, and then Ukrainian people won't struggle from that. Glenn, thank you for this interview. Thank you that you joined our show, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much. I must run now to another meeting. Okay,
Yeah.
bye-bye.
Bye. Nico, thank you that you came to our studio in such a not easy situation in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I would like to remind you that today we had an expert, the military expert, Glenn Grant, and also in the studio, the ex-US Navy, Nico Woods, and the head of the Ukrainian Freedom Fund. So thank you to be with us. See you very soon.